Good afternoon, this is Quintus Curtius. Welcome back to the podcast. And in this podcast, we'll be talking about the movie Redbelt, a 2008 film made by David Mamet about the world of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. And I'll talk a little bit about why I think this is a great movie and why I think it's important and why I think you should see it if you get a chance. But before I do that, I first want to go into a little bit of background about what David Mamet means to me, why I think he's a great writer, great director, and why I think his movies are so important, and his plays are so important. My first introduction to this guy was back in 1988, back when I was a student in college, and I had just happened to wander into a theater in Harvard Square in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And the movie that was showing there was his movie House of Games. It's a 1988 noir drama starring Joe Mantegna and Ricky Jay and a couple other of his mainstay. William Macy, I think, is in it. A couple other of his mainstay actors. And I just remember being really captivated by the dialogue, the way the actors spoke to each other. I mean, no one wrote dialogue like this guy. The way I heard it, it was almost like people were trying to say something, but they couldn't quite get out what they wanted to say. Everyone spoke in these truncated sentences, these chopped verbal styles. And in many ways in life, that's often what it seems like, even though we don't actually talk that way. The meanings come out that way because we can often not quite connect with people in certain situations. Sometimes what we intend to say is not what we really are able to say. And sometimes we have to rely on nonverbal communication. But I was really captivated by the verbal style, the writing style. But even more than that, I really liked the ideas that are explored in his movies. There are certain themes that David Mamet movies all seem to come back to. Now, he doesn't say it in this way, and he doesn't talk about it in this way, but sometimes the artist himself is not the best judge of his own art. Sometimes the viewer can have insights that the artist himself cannot have. But the themes that I think his movies deal with are themes of the difference between illusion and reality. And the other themes that his movies deal with are these moral conflicts, these moral and ethical conflicts that every man is faced with in the world. And it often comes down to, how does a man stay true to his ideals, but at the same time make his way in society and go about his business and earn a living and live life and have wives, girlfriends, jobs, relations with other people? How do you do that? How do you maintain that balance? How do you keep true to your own principles, but at the same time adjust for the inherently messy nature of life? And so, as you can imagine, this type of themes holds great interest for me, because those of you who have read my books or followed my blog know that a lot of what I write about, a lot of what really matters to me are moral and ethical problems that men face, that people face, but primarily men, it seems. How do you deal with these issues? How do you deal with these moral conflicts? And this is something that Cicero talked about. Obviously, he spent 3 books talking about it in On Duties. These are types of issues that historical figures have to deal with, that Cicero had to deal with during the Catalinian conspiracy, or the Roman generals during the War of Jugurtha. And these are themes that have perennial interest. And ever since that day, in 1988, when I saw my first David Mamet film, I've made a point to try to see all of his movies, even the obscure ones. And my favorite of all of his movies is apparently a an obscure movie that came out in 1991 called Homicide. And if you haven't seen this movie, and if you're a fan of David Mamet, you should really see it, because it is one of the greatest movies, I think, of the 1990s. Just this exploration of the difference between illusion and reality, and how a man can be seduced and betrayed by his own delusions, and what sort of moral problems result from that. But, House of Games, Things Change, Homicide, The Verdict, which was a movie that came out in the early 80s with Paul Newman, great film. Spanish Prisoner, Spartan. I mean, there's a whole list of movies that he's made, some of which are better than others, some of which are what I would say not very good at all. Movies like Lake Boat or American Buffalo, which are more sort of mood pieces maybe than should have been brought to the screen. But in any case, they all have his trademark writing style and concern for moral issues and problems, ethical issues. And he does it in such a way that it's very, very relevant to modern life. And I would go so far as to say no one out there is doing the type of movies that he's doing. When I say that David Mamet is the most virtuous of directors practicing today, what I mean that in a very specific way. I mean virtue in the sense of virtus, the Latin virtus, masculine virtue. He's the only movie maker, the only writer out there talking about the moral problems that men face, the moral problems, the ethical problems that are faced by men who have to make their way in this world. And Mamet himself is a gruff guy. He's a tough guy. Even though his writing and his plays and his movies are on a very, very high cerebral level, you would not know that. This is a guy who's built like a tank, a very muscular dude, talks in a very gruff way. In many ways, he's like a more intellectual version of a Sam Peckinpah from the 60s. So I'm a real big fan of this guy. I really, really like this guy. Although I will say that not an artist is not good in every field. I've read a couple of his books, and I was not. I found some of the ideas in them a little bit off. But hey, no one can do everything. A man can't do everything. I think where he really shines is drama, stage drama, and films. But Redbelt. Let's talk a little bit about Redbelt itself. This movie came out in 2008, and it's got a great cast. It stars a British actor, and I'm sure that I'm going to butcher this guy's name, so bear with me if anyone knows how to pronounce it. Chiwetel Ejiofor, Chiwetel. Chiwetel Ejiofor. I'm sure I'm pronouncing that wrong, but my apologies if I am. And this guy does a great job. And there's Mamet's usual stable of mainstay actors. Ricky Jay is in it. Joe Mantegna. And there's some big names in it too. Randy Couture, the Ultimate Fighter, or the MMA champion. You've got some Brazilian martial artists in here like John Machado and the famous Brazilian actress Alice Braga, and some other names, Jose Pablo Cantillo. You've got even the comedian Tim Allen is in this movie, although he plays a serious role. And the basic plot here, and again, plots in Mamet movies are not as important as the ideas. This is an ideas guy. Mamet is an ideas guy. He's not a don't go into this movie expecting to see some sort of action film. That's not what this is. I mean, the movie has action in it, but the action is really there to make moral commentary. And the basic plot of this movie is that you've got this jiu-jitsu teacher in Los Angeles. His name is Mike Terry, played by Chiwetel Ejiofor. And this guy is barely making ends meet. He's kind of struggling in his dojo, his practice. He's kind of having difficulty making the rent. And his wife, played by Alice Braga, would like to see him in the ring making some money, doing fighting, doing competitions, but this is a guy who we can tell right from the early scenes is a man of high moral principle. He says that I don't believe in competing for money because that degrades my art. That's what this guy believes. Mike Terry's view of the world is that competition for money is degrading. What matters to him is the purity of the martial arts art. So this is the basic background, the mindset of this guy. And then there's some setups here in the movie where you're led down a certain plot line. There's a woman that comes in, shoots out a window in his studio. And then there's some other scenes. Mike rescues a guy from a bar fight, and he gets close to this guy, and then he gets invited into the world of making movies, and then he gets led down the road of getting involved in promoting a title bout. And all of these events lead in one direction, and they lead in the direction of will he maintain his principles in the face of all of these forces which want to strip him of those principles? Or will he compromise? Will he find a way to balance his own personal views of the his own personal integrity with the way the world is? And how that turns out really is what makes the man. Because like so many of Mamet's movies, it ends in a very decisive, culminating moment. And it's usually a moment of truth. If we remember, another great movie that he wrote was The Edge, a movie from the mid-'90s starring Alec Baldwin and Anthony Hopkins. But there's always a culminating moment that involves fighting, that involves struggle, that involves combat. And that's when we really understand, we really begin to realize who we are as men. And these are themes that hold great interest for me, and they always have. And that's really, if you look at my writings and the books that I've put out, a lot of it really comes down to that. It really, crystallizes in these types of themes. And what's so great about the way this movie ends, which I won't obviously discuss, but it ends in a way that reminds us that we never can really know when our final and ultimate test will come. We never really know when we will be faced with our ultimate test. And it's going to come, we know that. But we also know that it's not going to happen in a way that we expect it to happen. And if the movie means anything, I think what it means is that no matter how hard it is, no matter how high of a price that you pay, you have to stay true to your ideals. You have to stay true to your principles, because in the end, those are the only things that are going to save you. When the chips are down, when everyone else has abandoned you, those are the only things that are going to save you. And that's what this movie shows. And that's really, I think, was what the message of Homicide was from the early 90s, his film from the 90s. This guy, the protagonist in that movie, deluded himself into seeing things as he wished to see them instead of seeing them as they really were. And he paid the ultimate price for that. And in Redbelt, the protagonist is essentially faced with an existential crisis. His wife sells him out, which often happens in Mamet films. The woman in his life runs for cover. His friends run for cover. He's faced with extreme financial difficulties. But the only redeeming things are his ideals. And unless a man is prepared to fight for those ideals, he's lost. He's ultimately lost. And no matter how hard it is, no matter how difficult the road, no matter how extreme the contest, no matter how brutal the struggle, we always have to maintain true. We always have to stay true to our ideals. Because even though it may sound it may sound trite, it may sound, immature, or it may sound idealistic. That's the only thing that's going to save us. And the people that go down, the people that go under, are the ones who betray their own principles, who sell out, who fail to see the difference between illusion and reality. So remember that. Remember, these are the themes of Mamet films. There are two themes: the difference between illusion and reality, and these moral struggles, these ethical battles that men must face in order to redeem themselves as men. And that's the reason why I love this guy so much. I like his movies. I like his plays. I think his work is so profoundly masculine. There's no one making movies out there now who's more masculine on an intellectual level than David Mamet is. And I'll take on anybody who challenges that, one-on-one or as a group, because that's a fact. There's no one out there doing what he's doing. And this is not masculinity in a stupid, ignorant, braggadocio type of way. This is a masculinity of principle and ideals, the type of masculinity that really matters and that really is going to stand the test of time, are these moral struggles. This is what matters. This is what matters in life. And that's what I get out of Redbelt. The true test begins when you think it has ended. And the real test is going to come in ways that you never expected. And unless you really have a moral compass, unless you have a moral guiding principle, unless you have a philosophical framework in which to structure your life, you're done. You're fucked. You're lost. And that's why these things are so important. And I'll never stop talking about them. I'll never stop talking about them. And they matter a great deal to me. And those of you who read On Duties, those of you who read Sallust's Conspiracy of Catiline, War of Jugurtha, understand that these are the underpinnings of all of Western history, really. This is one of the common threads that runs through all of our civilization, or any civilization. And if you don't see that, if that doesn't matter to you, then you need to check your pulse. You need to look at yourself in the mirror and say, how do I get my head out of my ass? Because this is what matters. And this is the battle that's being fought and waged all around us, every day, all day. This is what matters. This is what matters in the real world. Not some chicken shit bullshit on Twitter or on the news or CNN or some goddamn bullshit. What matters to us as men is the transactions that we have to enter in our lives on a daily basis, and whether we can stay true to our principles and balance them in such a way, maybe bend them when we need to, but not break them, so that we can make our way in this world. This is what every man, and frankly every woman, also has to deal with. So these are the ways we need to be thinking about things. You need to be thinking about this. And that's one thing I would ask listeners here to think about in the new year 2018. Think about moral and ethical problems. And once you start thinking about them, you'll begin to see them everywhere. And what I would say is, not only should you see Redbelt, go back and see some of David Mamet's earlier films. See House of Games, see Homicide, see The Edge, okay? See these movies. And then you'll know, you'll get an idea. And see Glengarry Glen Ross is also, I can't believe I forgot to mention that one. It's become a cult movie in many ways. But we shouldn't forget that behind all of the intense dialogue of that movie, there are problems, there are real moral issues being discussed there. And we have to be attuned to that. Because no one is talking about these things really anymore. They're not taught in the schools. They're not taught in the popular culture. They're not discussed in the home. No one's talking about it. So it kind of falls on guys like me, I suppose, to try to keep alive these sorts of discussions And that's what I have always tried to do, and something that I'll continue to do. And if you remember in the book Pantheon, there was an essay about the struggle of an explorer in the South Pole, Douglas Mawson, and the moral situations that he was faced with in his struggle for survival. I mean, these are the stories that we need to be thinking about. This is what matters in life. This is all of life. It really is. Because we have to deal with this stuff every day, every single day. Trust me on that. All right, I'm going to post this podcast on my site, and I'll also include a trailer for the movie Redbelt so you can get an idea of what it's about. But we will talk soon. I'm Quintus Curtius. Good night.